All right. So for folks who don't know, Shruti is one of the, I would say, I mean, she's been a very big mentor to me, and she has patiently listened to a lot of my problems when I used to be stuck. And she's one of the role models when it comes to building a tech company and exiting it. Wingman is now a part of Clari, and she has gone through all the entire 0 to 1 and the 1 to 10 journey at Wingman, and now at Clari she's seeing the 10 to 100 journey with her team, with the entire Wingman and Clari as well. She's someone who has been with in the sales industry for a very long time, and then she started Wingman with two of her other co-founders. And and today's session is a no holds barred session. One of the Shruti and I, we met over how do we hire folks in B2B marketing. I think Shruti had a conversation with me, and one thing led to another, and we kept talking about this, and we always came back to this. Okay, how do you hire marketers? Should folks look at agencies? Should not we look at agencies? And then and coincidentally, Shruti was one of the first speakers on our Saturdays Clubhouse era days, when Clubhouse was the cool looking tool in the world, and everyone was like, "Oh, I want to be on Clubhouse," or "I also want to be on Clubhouse." And Shruti was kind enough to be there, and I couldn't think of anyone better to come on this session to talk about how, at an early stage, when you're a young company, how do CEOs look at marketers and agencies. So yeah, with me I have Shafiq. You folks will know Shafiq as well. He's the one who deletes all the irrelevant chats on Slack channels. He's the one who is the he's the one who keeps all the everyone in the community in check.
Hey, hi everyone. Good to have you, Shruti. I think Siddharth has given a background about you. Why don't you just give us, and yeah, Niranjan, he is the Hitler of the Nazis. Hi, welcome, Shruti. Why don't you just give a brief background about yourself to our audience here?
Sure. Firstly, Siddharth, thanks for that introduction. I don't think, I have learned a lot more from a lot of the marketers and especially you. And I think just in terms of
Okay, folks. The audio and video
Yeah.
challenge.
from not knowing anything to wherever we are today. And I believe that, at any point in time, you're still at 20% of where you need to be. So, I would say it's the 0 to 0.2 kind of journey. And I think before this, my background has been MBA, finance, slightly more traditional roles and industries. So, all of this has been a lot of learning from scratch, and happy to share whatever mistakes we've made. And I think we've made more than our fair share of mistakes in this journey.
Sure. And all right, folks, before we get started, a big shout out to Zadl. And folks who don't know Zadl, Zadl provides event organizers and marketers a platform solution to easily manage the entire event lifecycle, from attendee registration and speaker management, irrespective of the event format. Enterprises such as Google, Microsoft, KPMG use Zadl to host their annual conferences, and we would recommend you post the event today. You can use a networking lounge where you can meet up one to one and you can have a chat. And with that, we will get started. We are already 10 minutes into the session. So now the no holds barred kind of a session starts. And again, Shruti, welcome. So, Shruti, and this question I've always asked you, right? How do you decide what kind of marketer you need when you're in early stage?
Yeah, I think.
Niranjan, simple.
So in fact, Kushal from my team is here, and I think she will tell you all that the first marketer that I hired was actually on the content and side, right? And I think the way I think I answer this question is that you need to kind of layer in trust and demand gen as you build your marketing stack, right? So Without trust, whatever efforts you do on the demand gen side don't really translate. And I think the way to use content is to build that trust. So I would say that you probably need to start out with that. It doesn't necessarily has to be the first person you hire, because you might like many first, the founder might be the first content writer as well for the company, right? But depending on where your own strengths lies, whether you want to hire somebody from day one but or not, you probably definitely want that person and skill to exist.
You've answered that. In partly when you're saying that you're looking at content as your first hire, right? From a CEO's perspective, right? Uh, when you think of marketing, what do you think? Do you think, like how Shafiq just said, right? Do you want, oh, I should concentrate on demand gen right now?
Demand
Forget
gen.
about the positioning, forget about the messaging that I can take care of. I'll write whatever needs to be written. Or do you think, okay, let's go ahead, build a story first? Story is important because story is like the Brahmastra of 2020s. If you write a
Story is your
story, then
strategy.
you're the
So I think it's not just about writing content for, like, doing a kick-ass blog, and you want to churn out like hundreds of blog posts every month. I think the reason why I think the content part is important is because it rolls into many things, right? So what happened was, the first time when we thought of it the same way, right? Like, let's do demand gen. And being a sales tech tool, of course, the way we thought of doing demand gen was through the SDR motion, through outbound. And we worked even there with an agency, and this was a very well recognized agency in the US. And we got like zero results, right? And I don't think this is the story that you will hear only from me. I think you'll hear this over and over again from many people. And what I could have taken two things from that, right? I could have said, hey, the agency was crappy, let me go hire another agency. Or I could have said, why are people not responding to this, right? And when you think about why are people not responding to it, it's all about, of course, is there a story, right? Is there a reason why people should trust you, right? Those are kind of the two big things. And
Mhm.
one is, the story is important because they need to believe that you understand the problem, and you have a perspective on the problem, that irrespective of whether or not they know what your solution does, they feel that they relate to the story so strongly, and they relate to the way you've described the problem so strongly, that they at least want to look at your solution, right? And then the second part of it is trust, right? And that is where they are trying to create a proxy for, oh, I don't know, and I don't have the time to waste on every cold email. Is there a proxy for other people who have trusted this, so that I can also go trust them, right? So that's kind of what we realized after our outbound efforts, that without fixing those two, whatever outbound we did wasn't going to get us results, which meant that we had to go back and craft that story, and also craft that trust piece, right? And again, for both of those, were some of the early things we did from a marketing perspective. Now, that might not necessarily fit in with like a traditional definition of marketing that people have, but that is definitely a very important part of what you need to do under the gambit of marketing early on.
Got it. So I have a follow-up question on this. You briefly mentioned agencies as well. So between hiring a full-time resource for marketing versus hiring an agency early on, what what was the framework for your decision making, choosing between the two?
Yeah. So for us, and I think, again, this is probably a lesson that we learned, right? The first time I was trying to hire an agency for doing content or for doing anything else, I felt it was, so much of it was inside my head that it would be so hard to actually onboard someone, right? And therefore, a lot of that onboarding also, so this was when we were trying to onboard an agency, right? A lot of that onboarding also looked like, basically me getting on like
Mhm.
multiple 1 hour calls with them and saying, hey, I think we are being very organized. So let's do the first call on the persona. Let's do the second call on the product. Let's do the third call on, the problem that we are trying to solve, whatever else, right? But
Mhm.
at the end of that, two things happen, right? Like one is you are doing a brain dump or whatever, but you're not processing everything. Two is if that agency doesn't work out or you want to maybe experiment with two agencies in parallel,
Hmm.
you have to repeat that same process all over again.
Yeah.
So, what I learned through that process was I should have invested more time in creating enough documentation to begin with so that I would, one, be able to
Hmm.
go back and look at multiple people that I could have that same conversation with without me speaking for 5 hours with each agency. um, because then I was just stuck, right? And then I was like, okay, this is too much effort, this is too much pain to onboard an agency, and if that agency doesn't work out, I might as well just go hire someone. Right? That was the lens with which I went at it. I know people have had successful, experiences with going with an agency the first time, but I think
Mhm.
this kind of is a hurdle that people, often have. Of course, once we had our first content person, and in fact she's on the call here today. What we then did when we wanted to work with an agency was, we did a much better job at documenting everything. So literally when we needed to speak to an agency, we could say, hey, here is the dump of, like, the persona, the this, the that. Here is the assignment. Now if they come back with a poor output, it's not because your input is poor. And then you can actually objectively compare across multiple outputs.
I mean, Shruti, Shafiq was smiling as soon as you said documentation. I think because half of his life goes into documentation.
So yeah,
Okay.
between chicken and the egg, documentation came first.
The readme file on how to produce an egg.
And how should a chicken produce the egg? That also needs a proper SOP. It cannot work without an SOP.
Yeah, yeah. So even before starting H11S on Slack, I had a document ready. So,
Oh my God. I mean, the pains I have gone through, just to like Shafiq would mark out, reply here,
so
don't reply
at
here,
2 a.m.
reply
in the
here.
morning, I would just finish up a documentation and share the doc with Rohit, Sid, and Chirayu, and basically expect them to revert early morning. So yeah, then she
And
has
I
happened,
typically
and
come from that startup part of India where documentation is like, what documentation? Oh, you needed one.
all right, come
Yes.
back, come back.
So,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. So when you Shruti, and I'm now going a little bit on the in-house marketer front, right? When you're looking at, I mean, you are an early stage company. You've decided, okay, let me do a first hire, whether it's in content, whether it's in story or demand, right? Uh, how do you look at hiring that marketer? How do you look at, okay, saying that, okay, I mean, you have who you want, right? It may be a content marketer, it may be a product, it may be a demand gen, but how do you go out, because you're an early stage, you're not sure about whether you'll get somebody who you exactly want. So can you just walk us through the entire mental model or the entire process that you had to hire somebody who's hire the first person on your team?
Sure. So I think, both, of course, every time you hire the first time for a role, right, it's like a full exercise. And I, of course, learned this the hard way because there were people that I hired, and I then realized that, listen, I hadn't thought through fully the role, and it's not like, the other person's fault. And these can be expensive and painful decisions. So my go to guide then became that, one, of course, you start with thinking about what do you want this person to do, but then you have to go back and think about how do I test for whether the person can do these things, because not all of those things can be tested in an interview, right? And then you can move away from just having long interview processes, because honestly you also don't have anybody else in the organization who can interview the person, right? Because if I am the only person on the business side, then there are only that many things I can ask a person in an interview without like intimidating the person or just boring them. And second, and of course, thirdly, as an early stage startup, you are also selling yourself, selling the company, and selling the role, because people have lots of choices. So then you have to kind of take a step back and say, how do I condense this, right? So this is what I did. So for the instance of like the content marketing piece, it was saying that, okay, One is, of course, I need to be able to gauge writing skills. Two is I need to be able to gauge the ability for this person to go back and think of, think, so not just writing skills in terms of blogs, right, but like social smaller pieces of content, or like funny stuff, right? Like our tone has always been a little bit more fun and engaging. um, and so can that person do that, right? And there can be, so of course, the first part everybody does, right? You can ask people either for things that they can write for you, or for existing pieces of work that already are out there. um, but the second part is a little bit tricky, right? So that's where you kind of can think of a fun assignment, right? You can say, hey, we are just doing this launch. Can you come up with like three different memes to promote this message? So that you're also getting to see how creative they are. Are they plugged into the kind of pop culture stuff that your audience is plugged into, things like that, right? And then, of course, you can do some interviews, though I think in a content setting, that uh, can amount to you asking them to maybe on the go rewrite or comment on something. Right. So, like, I could open up my website and say, hey, what do you absolutely hate about this? Right. What would you do differently and why? Right. So, you just want to kind of see how they think through that. And then, of course, the biggest part is, can you also go back and maybe speak to some references, because that always helps. So I think did that process. Now, what you're looking for through that process is, one, their ability to also be critical of you or the existing pieces of work that you are showing them, because you realize that you are the CEO, but also the first marketer. And so you want to make sure that they are able to come back and question that, because you don't want whatever has happened as becoming the default tone or, culture of the brand. And then secondly, you want to see, how good they are, how creative they are, and are they able to actually think of it from your persona's perspective. Now, the second part can actually be very tricky. What we have seen is, if you're selling to the tech crowd, you might actually find it easier in India, right, to hire writers and content people. If you're selling to, the sales crowd, that sometimes might be harder, because people might not necessarily have done sales themselves and might not necessarily relate to what the life of a sales leader in the US looks like. So that is actually an important skill to test for, and therefore, then going through maybe a few pieces of like, how do they think about persona, how would they do their persona research, all of that comes in. Um, okay, I realize I've spoken for a long time, and I don't know whether I've answered your question, so I'll just pause and let you ask me again.
No, no, no. We were all very keenly listening to you. I was actually taking down notes and I was typing on my computer so that if in post the session I can share it with everyone and I can appear as a cool person on my Slack community. But yes, and I'm going to take this from what you just told right now, right? That in during the interview you can't really hire for culture fit, right? And I kind of feel that that's something which, as a first person of a function, especially in marketing, that is something is very crucial, because that's how the team is going to be built, right? And like you talked about agency, right? Because if you hire an agency and it doesn't work out with them, you have to go back to an agency again, go back to the drawing board. It's the same situation with, if you hire the first marketer, it doesn't work out, then you have to go back, and it's a lot of human bandwidth, a lot of capital invested, especially in hiring. Because and I'm playing the devil's advocate here, right? With an agency, you can at least cut relationships and and not be affected in a in a lot. But with a person which you have hired, right, at an early stage, it leaves a deep scar in the team as well, right? So
Yeah.
how, as a CEO, how do you think you should go about it and say that, okay, hey, I'm going to, this is the kind of, how do you find for that fit for that culture? Like, how do you I mean, I'm not able to frame it in the right way. I think Shafiq is much better at words than I am, with words than I am, and not at words. And how do you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think to frame it differently than what Sid just mentioned, it is easier to fire an agency than to fire an employee. And with respect to the effort involved, you will have to train the differentiation that you talked about, right? Um, in order to do a call and explain the value proposition, what the product does, who you are targeting, what is the GTA motion going to be like, and stuff. Uh, you are going to do the same thing with a new hire as well. That would probably be in terms of training and onboarding for the new hire, which is a different for agency, but the effort involved is the same.
Yeah. So I think generally hiring for culture fit is hard, right? Especially as an early stage, because you haven't fully defined out your culture, right? And so it's kind of also an ever evolving process. I think it's important to, even at the fairly early stage, have at least two or three guiding principles that the founding team aligns on. And they might not be documented somewhere or spoken about actively all the time in a formal setting, but basic things like, would you hire somebody who is basically a asshole genius, or would you hire somebody who's a
Mm-hmm.
average team player, right? Like some like A or B kind of things that help you define where do I tilt, and it's not going to be absolute on these axes. I think those are useful, right? So for us, and then similarly to, especially when you're thinking of marketing, right, to also have one or two guiding principles for the brand, right? Again, because those things, the reason why you need to hire for culture fit is because it's hard for somebody to change their innate personality, right?
Sure.
When you're going to show up at work and spend 8 to 10 hours there, you have to be able to bring your whole self there, right? So if that alignment isn't good, it's just going to cause problems for everyone. So what is important is first to know what you're hiring for in terms of a culture fit, right? Like an example for us was, hey, we want this to be a fun and playful brand because that is what we would want to relate with, and that is what we know our persona would want to relate with, right? We don't want yet another boring company coming up with serious documentation that only other serious people want to read, but nobody in our persona wants to ever engage with. So
Sure.
once you've decided that, right, that is an important part of testing for, right? Which is why our assessment process would then test people by asking them to make memes rather than asking them to write like, an ebook. So I
Sure.
think that's part of it. The second part of it is also going back and forth
Think I lost her. Is it
Yes, yes. Even I lost her.
okay?
I think now the entire.
but each of those things is actually available as a set of interview questions that you can then ask people about, right? And of course, a lot of that is, that basic question looks very obvious, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
if it is around say customer obsession, right? The first level of question could be like, hey, can you give me an example where you demonstrated customer obsession, right? Or where you had to maybe fight with somebody internally for on behalf of a customer. That first level of question is easy, and again, this might not apply to a marketing role, but then what you have to get very good at from an interview process is to be able to ask the second and third level of questions there, right? So if somebody responded with a situation, now you modify the situation, you add another layer to it and say, okay, if this was different in this situation, how would you then have reacted? So then you actually get to hear their active thinking process rather than everybody prepares for like 5, 6 situations from their work life that they want to go talk about in an interview. So yeah, I think that's another thing. So what I do is like, for each role have like 2 or 3 things that I want to, the softer parts that I want to test for, and then match that up with questions that I want to ask to assess for those, so that on the fly I'm not thinking about those things.
Got it. And now we'll switch to the darker side or the bright side or the light side. I mean, however people in the audience want to take it. Uh, how do you choose an agency? And we talked about this, and I mean, we talked a little bit about this where you told about, and I would love to stress on that where you had worked with a US agency and you got zero results. So Indian agencies in the house, please hit up Shruti. There might be a little soft spot there. But yeah, I mean,
Um, I
coming
also
to
work with some Indian agents.
oh, okay, okay. Those were good, right?
Said you are running a side agency. You did not tell us about.
I wish I would have pitched it to Shruti and I would be like, see that US agency didn't give you results. I am an Indian. I'll give you. All right. Before I become full mode patriotic and I take it to another level. But yeah. So on the agency front, right? Uh, and you've gone through multiple agencies, and uh, as a founder, when do you decide, okay, hey, I should go for an agency, and how do you choose the agency, right? I mean, does it come recommended from from folks, or is it like you have a founders group networking, or do you ask somebody who is a specialist in that field and they refer you, and how do you align with them and how do you choose them, like, okay, this is the agency that I think would be most successful with me.
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of this comes from failed experiments, right? So I can probably tell you more about things not to do than about things to do. Um, yes. So one was, I think, one lesson that I learned was that it's useful to have done at least, a 0 to 0.1 in anything before you decide to outsource it, right? Whether that is content, SEO, digital marketing, whatever it is, right? Because you need to understand what is behind it, right? And therefore, what kind of things to look for when you're hiring. So, of course, one of the first mistakes we made, right, when we were hiring, say, the first agency in the US was like we had never done outbound. We said, okay, somebody else will come and do it. They'll be able to do it at scale. Something will come of it, right? And then you don't know what are all the things that they are doing wrong because you've never done it yourself. So one is like don't outsource anything without at least trying some version of it yourself, right? Even if that means like you're slowing down the process a little bit, or so it'll appear early on, but it'll have huge benefits in the future. The second thing was when I decided to hire for agencies, and I think broadly for service providers, definitely references, are the main way that I go and look for those. Because I think everybody gets so many inbound emails from different service providers, and it's very hard, right? Like literally that same principle of how do you create trust, right? In a case of a product, the trust can come from G2 and things like that. In case of a service provider, again, that trust could come if you're listed on Upwork, etc., but otherwise it has to come through the network that you've already serviced. So I would always go to my network asking for recommendations. Now, that is not foolproof, and that definitely makes the starting point a little bit limited. So that's one lesson that I realized that unless you have like 5 to 10 recommendations to choose from, you're going to make a bad decision. Right. So this is what happened to us when we were like trying to look for an agency to do the marketing website for us. Right. We went out there. We asked our network. We came back with like 4 or 5 recommendations. None of them seemed very good. We looked at their work, but then we were like, what other choice do we have? Right. At that point, I said, because I'd already learned my lesson, I told my marketer, we can't go with any of these 4 or 5. I know you've spent 3 weeks looking for them and vetting these agencies. If we are not 100% sure of any of them, we just have to go and ask more people for references, right? So I think that's also an important learning, that don't stop, right, unless you feel that you have a good fit. Sometimes we all go with the thing of let's get this done, but when it comes to hiring decisions, whether internal or external, those are long and painful. And then once you actually have you know, one is when you actually speak to 5 or 10 service providers in the same space, you quickly learn, right, what are the things to look out for, what are the things that stand out, what are the things that you need to focus on. And the second important thing is to figure out pricing models. First thing, they will give you pricing models based on the ad spend, right? Which, in some sense makes sense. You're saying that this is the amount of work I'm doing for you, but literally to spend $100 versus spend $1,000, it doesn't take 10x the amount of work, right? When you're setting up Google AdWords. So, it's not, sometimes people will not change their pricing models for you, but the ability for them to actually defend it, and to explain to you why they are thinking of pricing it a certain way, which you don't think aligns with your own incentives, is going to give you an insight on how they think about their customers. So that was, I think, an important thing. And okay to go and experiment with multiple types of campaigns, versus, I'll just blow up your budget in one campaign because I will get my money anyways.
Uh, Shruti, now I'll just ask you to put on an agency owner's hat, right? And say you're talking to an early stage CEO, right? From all the various interactions you've had and all the various things you've had, how is it that you would pitch an agency? How would it that you would like, if you were the agency head, how would you pitch yourself to an early stage CEO?
Wow, you're putting me in the hot seat, huh? Um, so I think, and this actually also equally well applies to early stage employees, right? I would, spend a lot of time thinking about the questions that I want to ask because it's a two-way match, right? So even before I start pitching myself to the founder, right, I would ask them my set of like 3 or 4 questions. What matter? Like, how do I think about my agency work, right? Like, maybe I am a volume player. Maybe I am somebody who likes to handcraft every campaign. Maybe I'm, like, I think there is a gamut of people out there. And therefore, you also have like your cultural values and principles, right? So I would say that one is to definitely ask a couple of those questions and to figure out whether there's a good match or not. Right. The second is to actually understand from them what they would consider as a success or a failure, right? So I, even when I would pitch to them, I would say, okay, you want me to say do demand gen for you. I'm going to try and run these 3 campaigns like you've described to me. Now, what has to go back to the drawing board for you? Would you like, what would make you say that I'm giving up on this and I'm moving on? Right? Are they going to, basically, that is going to help them also think a little bit deeply about how do they want to evaluate? Because very often, as early stage founders, you also don't know what is down the road, right? Actually, as an agency, you might have seen that failure happen multiple times more than the founder has seen. And if you can give them that value of at least showing them the different reasons why something might fail, they will at least trust you a little bit more, right? Rather than trying to convince them that, listen, I am the best agency, nothing will ever fail. Right? So I will actually use that almost as a consultative discussion, right? To Because one is that'll help them understand that I know my shit, and two, that'll if nothing else, they will have gotten some value out of that conversation and they'll remember that conversation, and hopefully they'll come back to me.
Cool. And this is now coming. I'm putting you again in the hot seat. Uh, what do you think is the CEO's role in marketing, right? And how does it change over a period of time? I mean, it changes. I know it changes. It does change. But how, as per you, how does it change? And what is the role of a CEO when it comes to in early stage 0 to 1, 1 to 10? What is the role of a CEO in marketing?
Sure. I think the CEO is basically the first brand ambassador, right? And so, um, the CEO's role is very crucial to being able to come out there and be the one person that people recognize more than before they even recognize the company or the product. Right. So it's definitely about putting yourself out there, building your radius of trust, and constantly using that almost as a pyramid to keep expanding the trust for people to come and work with you. That is absolutely non-negotiable. Like, even if you hire a superstar marketer, but just because you carry a different title, people are going to come and want to hear from you than from the superstar marketer, right? So, irrespective of whatever happens, you have to recognize that you are the first person that everybody is going to associate with the brand. And it's important to make sure that you're ready to put yourself out there. It might not be easy for everyone. It wasn't easy for me. I wasn't naturally, going out there posting on LinkedIn without, maybe I would post once a month, maybe look at that post, delete it like 5 times, and then, never post again. But then over a period of time, you realize that that is an important part of your job. The second part of your job, like I said, is to be the early experimenter, right? So that, because by default, uh, we don't trust what we hear when somebody else tells us that, right? So the sooner you realize that if the way you learn and you believe things is by doing them yourself, then you might as well go out and do those sooner rather than later. Because otherwise you're going to hire people to do them, and then you're not going to trust them, and then you're going to go through that cycle by paining a lot of people in that process. So I think being the first brand ambassador, being the first experimenter, and I think the third part of it is just being somebody who is constantly thinking about the whole, positioning, messaging, persona, right? Like, that is one part that you cannot, like, you have to trust other people to do it, but you can't just leave it to other people. You have to constantly engage with, whoever you're creating the product for. um, and then how does this change, right? So I think for each of these things, it basically goes from you being the person doing it, to you being the person setting the tone for it. Right. And you're going to move away from doing any of these things directly as the team scales. But people are still going to look at you to set the right tone. And part of it is because you've already established yourself as the brand ambassador, right? So you are going to constantly be setting the tone. But it's important that you're setting the tone in private with your team rather than just going out there. And, like, I know some CEOs who will go and first make an announcement and then come and tell the team, oh yeah, I just announced it, so now let's go and do it. Right. So make sure that you're not leaving it to surprises, and keeping your team up at all times of the day and night, because we are surprising them.
So okay, go ahead, Shafiq, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a related question to this. As a CEO, you are generally surrounded by yes men because you have authority over other people, and people generally tend to say yes to whatever the CEO wants. You basically give it to them. And in things like positioning, branding, messaging, or a blog going, or an important announcement going live, and the words that you use to describe that announcement or the positioning of the product, right? Have you faced disagreement between you and the marketing team, or whoever is heading that project for you? And was it important for them to drive consensus versus something like, okay, you disagree and commit to it?
Yeah, it's a important question. I think, and it's not an easy one, and it doesn't get answered in one project, right? I think it has to be consistently emphasized, because unfortunately, the title carries a weight, right? So whether or not, like, I could be humorous and have fun with my team, but you're right that people are going to think twice about maybe challenging me versus challenging a peer, right? And so you have to constantly be conscious about that, right? Firstly, and you have to know that if somebody is challenging you, then they've probably already thought twice about it, right? um, So one is that, but I think from a process perspective, right, like I said, it starts with when you're interviewing somebody, you have to set that tone, right? You have to tell them, ask them to critique something. You have to then emphasize to them that you're asking them to critique it because it's important that people have that voice, right? And that you want, that is an important part of their role that you want them to play. Then during your one-on-one discussions or your performance appraisal discussions, you again need to make sure that that is something that is coming through, right? And that is something that you're living up to. It's not just something that you once mentioned in an interview because you thought, I'm going to put that in my interview playbook, right? So that when it actually comes to challenging you on a particular project, right, people are not second guessing themselves, right? Like, how will it be received if I challenge this? Right. But at the same time, they would then have thought about, like, if I want to challenge, if I want to question this, then what do I need to put forward to be able to do that, right? So one of the things that we do as a team is we would, for example, even like we are in the middle of redoing our website, we would say, okay, let's generate a couple of options, right? People might know that by default, I will tend to go with one option maybe. But then, you can actually you can actually have a discussion once you have two options, right? Versus if you have just one option and you're trying to tweak it. And those two options ideally look different enough that you're then able to discuss the two options as a way to understand what the thinking behind the two is, or what one accomplishes versus what the other one doesn't accomplish. So I think the thing is, even when you're giving feedback, it's a lot about saying, hey, I'm giving this feedback because I think it doesn't do A, B, or C, that we already talked about, or that is our guiding principle around what our persona wants, or whatever it is, right? So I think it's important to also go back and invest time and energy on creating those frameworks with your team, on discussing those frameworks, so that you're not questioning just the outcomes, right? Then when the questioning happens, you're questioning the framework and you're saying that, oh, maybe we agreed on this as the framework or as the assumption 6 months back, but maybe something has changed, right? Maybe the market has changed, maybe the persona has changed. And then that makes for a much richer conversation, and then people are much more predictable when they are doing work in the future.
Got it. So makes sense. I think this also calls for the CEO actively communicating to the team that you got to do the right thing by the user or for the company rather than try and impress me all the time.
Exactly.
I'm speaking from a marketer's vantage point. Like at sometimes it is like understood that you gotta please me, you gotta just agree with what I'm saying. This is my expectation. You meet it. Whether that is right or wrong is out of question, right?
Yeah, but there are personality and cult type CEOs as well, so you have to choose who you're working with.
Yeah, yeah.
So, Shruti, between a voice, a vote, and a veto, right? Where does the CEO sit in marketing? Good question, no?
Good question. I think on a project level, it should just be a vote. I think on the framework level, it should be the voice. Yeah, and I think on the budget level, it's sometimes a veto.
It has to be
It
on the
has to
budget.
be.
It
It
has to
has
be on the budget.
to be. Nice
Uh,
one. Nice question, Sid. Good that you came prepared.
Good that I came prepared. This is like my teacher judging me. Okay, 5 out of 10. You did half of it right. 5 out of 10. I'll give you. Uh, all right. And Shruti, there were a few questions that the audience wanted you to answer, right?
So
And we
before
yeah.
Siddharth, before we go to the question that people have asked in the registration phase, there is a relevant question asked by Tej in the Q&A panel here in Ladal,
Can
and
you?
which is related to the initial conversation around onboarding an agency and onboarding a full-time marketer. What are the good Tej is asking? What are the good onboarding look like for a lead or managerial role from a CEO's perspective? Are the signs of it working or not in the long term, which either parties can look out for? What are the signs essentially, whether it is working or not, uh, for either parties?
Sure. So I think from a CEO's perspective, so let's maybe take an example, right, to get this to be more specific. Suppose I'm hiring my first person to lead demand gen for the company, right? And maybe this is the first demand gen person ever in the company, right? Like, and this person now has to go build the team as well. So demand gen doesn't exist. Now I have to onboard this person. How's that onboarding going? Right. I think the first thing is like, it's an important part of that onboarding is what are the type of questions that person is coming and asking you, right? Which is going to show you their level of ownership, involvement, at what level are they thinking, right? Are they coming and essentially, trying to be incremental in a situation where, the baseline didn't exist, right? Like, I was the person going out there and maybe just posting on LinkedIn. Some people were coming and signing up on the website, and that's it. Now, am I when I'm trying to so one is, right, are they trying to be incremental, or are they actually understanding the business enough, right? That is an important part. The second is how much are they willing to think from first principles versus just trying to plug and play what they've already learned, right? That becomes evident in onboarding as well. So one thing that, of course, you would do as part of onboarding is you would ask that person to come up with like a 30, 60, 90-day plan, because they are in a managerial role. And when they are coming up with that plan, you would assess them on not just what that final outcome looks like, but how are they trying to get there, right? Are they being collaborative with other people in the team? How often are they only coming to you for questions versus going to everybody else, doing their first level of research and then coming to you, right? Sometimes people are just coming to you because they want to show you that they are being busy and that they're doing the work, right? But they're not doing enough work, and that's why they're coming to you more often. So I think that's the other part. And I think from the from the marketer standpoint, right, like, um, that is also a good time to maybe test whether somebody is ready to be challenged, right? And if you're proposing something that is maybe dramatically different, or if you actually believe that something that is happening that is wrong, and you want to be the marketer who doesn't just want to be the yes man or yes woman, then you need to use that also as a testing ground to maybe give early critical feedback, right, and see how that is landing, so that you can then also decide, one, whether this is the place for me in the long run. I mean, hopefully you've decided that before, but if you're still answering that question. But then secondly, you also want to learn, how do I put my point across, right? Because that could also be an important learning for you to succeed in the organization. Yeah, and I think the third part is ambitious, right? Both people look at this differently. I think CEOs sometimes set very aggressive targets because they want to see how people react to it, right? They don't necessarily think that everybody is going to say yes, I'm going to do this tomorrow. So I think you have to judge ambition, as the CEO, but you also, as the marketer, have to, taper that down, because, ambition has to come with budgets, but sometimes those things don't coexist.
Yeah, budget doesn't exist. All right. We have one question from Niranjan. Do you not hire the person who can deliver ROI the quickest?
There is no guarantee when you're hiring whether the person can deliver ROI quickest. And I think the thing is that very often people look at this as a one-dimensional thing, that maybe today I'll hire a demand gen person, tomorrow I'll hire a content person. But you have to constantly layer those two. So today what will deliver the most ROI is going to change tomorrow, right? Because if you're you it's like a leveling up game, right? Like, okay, I've built a basic outline of what a brand is. Now I'm going to use that to maybe do some demand gen. Now I have to layer that with doing some thought leadership. Then I can layer that with doing like a different type of demand gen. So I think, one, that answer keeps changing, and two, there is no good way to assess who's going to deliver quick ROI.
Nine women can't deliver a baby in 1 month. A CEO used to tell me this. Not a CEO, a marketer, head of marketing used to tell me this when they would come out of a meeting with the CEO.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
but if you have the budget, can you get it done?
But then I will cut back your budget.
uh, okay. This is a good question, and this is by Mufaddal. What are some key KPIs which CEOs monitor for, on a marketing strategy front? So, I mean,
Um,
if I were to ask you differently, this Shruti, what were the
Marketing
KPIs?
KPIs essentially.
Yeah, what were the KPIs you looked at, when you had a marketing function, sort of in the at Wingman?
we still do. We still do. And we are hiring in that function as well. But okay, so I think, I mean, of course, a lot of these are fairly standard, right? Like you're looking at top of the funnel, and it depends a little bit on the business model. For us, just for context, for everyone, is we get like 80 to 90% of our revenue from inbound leads, and so an important KPI of whatever marketing is doing is what is the traffic that's coming in, how many MQLs or whatever, like emails are we getting from that, and how many demos are we getting from that, right? That's one part of that funnel. For us, some of these, and I think for most people, some of these are, because a lot of this traffic, in our case especially, is entirely organic, right? Which means that these are already lagging indicators, because there's probably a lot of things that are happening outside, on the content side, on the social media side, that is leading to all of this happening. So while we look at these, right, we also look at investments that we are making in those. So sometimes those KPIs are simply LinkedIn follower counts for the brand, but sometimes it's actually just input metrics, because those are kind of the leading indicators, and unfortunately there's nothing else that you can proxy that for. And then, of course, on the SEO side, we do look at how many pages in the 1 to 10 ranking, or the first page, etc.
I think you are on mute. I
Can
can't
you
hear
hear
you.
me?
Yeah, I can hear now.
Okay. Yeah. So, Shruti, thanks for doing this and talking to us about, how as a CEO you evaluated marketers and agencies, and how the process was for you and what all you have learned across the way. And B, it's always lovely chatting with you. You always give the answers right from the heart, no holds barred, and that's what we love here at S11S. Uh, and a few questions that folks had asked when they had registered. We'll go through them one by one, right? Some of them we've answered in a bit. I mean, the first question that was asked was, what's the ideal team roles for seed stage companies with respect to marketing? I think you talked about, how you look at it from a content perspective, like get your content right and then build on the other functions. But if I were to expand on that, right, what
Yeah.
is how you're going to layer it, right? I mean, after content, what?
Sure. So I think one is, again, it depends on how large your seed round was. But, I think one thing that we probably don't do a lot in India is we don't work as much with agencies, right? I was surprised to hear that, somebody the size of Gong probably had like a marketing team of 30 or so, right? At a stage where they are like a few $100 million in revenue. So I would say that yes, in some sense, you can, if you're trying to do a very basic division of skill set, right, you need demand gen and you need content, and content and branding, not just content. But I would say that, like, even if you were able to just hire two people, hire one of each, right, and then have these two people figure out what their strength is and where do they want to maybe hire agencies or freelancers. So that even if you're not able to hire everybody on day one, and this is a big problem that people have, right? Like they'll be like, okay, now I'm trying to hire uh, for marketing. Now how many people do I need to hire? Because people tell me there are like 6 different roles that they need minimum to start with, right? Like there's SEO, there is ads, there is partnerships, there is so I think you have to kind of say, okay, if I were to just roll this up, it's 2 roles, and then within these 2 roles, I could either hire more internally or I could outsource, and then I will maybe switch that balance depending on my budget, depending on my ability to wait, depending on how predictable I think the scaling is. And thirdly, also, how predictable is it that I know which role do I need to scale more? So, different companies have very different answers to this, because if you're in an established category where there is enough, search volume, then maybe your demand gen strategy is going to lead the way. But if you're in a category where it's a new category, nobody's heard of it, nobody's searching for those things, then you have to kind of lead it with thought leadership. So those answers are also different, and people don't often nuance that out.
Got it. So I think you've also answered the second question, which was for an early stage startup, should we invest more in demand or brand? So I think that question's also been answered. So folks, again, nuance it, go back to your drawing board, understand as a company what you are. If demand exists and you want to capture it, then you know who to hire for. If you're in a niche category, I mean, go for the other one, right? And this is an interesting question, Shruti. When should a company migrate from agency to in-house? And you just talked about this, saying that marketing and agencies should work more hand in hand. I mean, especially in an Indian SaaS context, they should start working. But when should a company start migrating from an agency to in-house team?
Yeah, so I think that answer is very subjective. Like I said, I've seen some very large companies continue to work with agencies, and then there might be reasons, or there might be small niches where you continue to work with agencies, right? So, for example, maybe you will always work with, say, events agency, or maybe you'll always work with a agency for doing your website design and development. And then there will be other things, or maybe video, right? Maybe those are things that you will continue to use as an agency model for a long period of time. I think for the more core things, essentially content and demand, right? I would say maybe demand is the first one that comes fully in house, and then content could still continue to work on a hybrid model. And the reason for keeping demand somewhat flexible is content somewhat flexible is that um, one is it allows you to scale things up quickly, right? And you also get more, maybe, voices, variety, etc. And thirdly, it allows you to actually develop the right type of org structure, right? Where you know that people who are working in house will have the ability to grow, and you can give them more variety of work versus, just hiring a lot of junior people who are sitting and doing like 20-30 blogs a month. And then, you have like many of them, and then they don't see a growth path. Right. But if you do a hybrid of in-house versus agency, then you're also able to give each person some variety. And that, of course, helps the person, but it also helps you because you get much better quality.
Got it. So Prashant asked this question on the chat. What does Wingman's marketing team looks like right now, and what you would have done differently?
Sure. So right now, I'm struggling to answer exactly how many people there are in marketing. But we have 3 divisions, right? So there is demand, there is content, and there is product marketing, right? And I think one thing that I would have done differently is I would have probably split out product marketing and content sooner in our journey. Because what happens otherwise is that there is always enough to be written about product and about more kind of tangible down the funnel things, that your up the funnel content suffers, right? And so it's useful to maybe split those two out and Today we have split it out, but I think maybe in hindsight I might have done that earlier. Um, I would say, and the other thing is, we thought a lot about, like, when to bring in a design person for the marketing team. Of course, for some time we were having the product design person double up and do some work with us. But I think the other question there was, like, when should you bring somebody senior on the design side within marketing? And I think that is again something that is very important, because while we invested a fair amount early on in the tone of the brand, I don't think we invested enough in the creatives and the look and feel of the brand. I know sometimes people actually do the reverse, but yeah, that was kind of also an important lesson. So we did work with designers or sometimes freelancers and things like that. But I think it's an important aspect of the brand image, literally.
Got it. And I mean, to close off this discussion, and one last question, and this again comes to from an agency point of view. What are some of the red flags to look out for when evaluating a marketing agency?
Yeah. So, one is, if you tell them that you are B2B and then their pitch deck only contains all B2C logos, then either they don't know the difference between B2B and B2C, or they haven't done any B2B work, right? Or they were not listening to you. All three of them can be bad. But you'll be surprised how many times that happens, right? Like, you'll send them a blurb and you'll do like all these onboarding calls with them, and then they'll send you a deck which has like one school that they worked with and like one some local grocer that they worked with or something. Um, so one is, I think, make sure that you're working with somebody who at least understands B2B, and there is a fair amount of difference, right, when it comes to understanding the channels, understanding those type of things. Um, I would say the second thing is, when you, and again, I guess some of those are contextual, but like, if they say that on day one they want to, experiment with like every channel that is out there, right? Like, I'll do LinkedIn ads for you, and I'll also do Facebook ads for you, and all of them together will magically work, right? Then you also know that that is a red flag, because there has to be some thought behind what you prioritize and why. And it's not just about, I don't want to blow up all my budget on day one, but more nuanced reasons. I think those are the kind of the two big ones. And especially because of the context historically in India, of there being many more B2C companies and B2B being relatively new, you will encounter both of those very often. A lot of times people would have done a lot more Facebook ads than they would have done LinkedIn ads. And they might not even necessarily recognize the difference or the nuances between how they need to be run differently. Um, yeah.
Omni-channel campaign orchestration. I think that's basically a fancy word for I'll take your budget and run everything within 5 days.
Yeah.
Correct.
So, Sid, if you are done with the list of questions that we got, I have one final question around the acquisition. Shruti, if you would like to talk about it, what was the story like? What happened in the background? Why did you even decide to join hands with Clari?
Sure. So I think one is, when the conversation started, we were actively in the fundraise mode. We were not really looking at an acquisition at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
But I had spoken to other founders who had gone through a journey before, and I was like, why would you do that? And the answer that really stuck with me was, like, somebody told me that, hey, I could have, ultimately my goal with starting the company was I wanted to get to an IPO, right? And I realized that, I could have gotten there in maybe 7-8 years if I was lucky. But there were lots of things that I didn't know in that journey. But this seemed like, a much faster way of getting there, right? And this seemed like a more sure shot way of getting there. I mean, of course, there's nothing sure shot in the startup world, especially not in this environment. But and I think that's exactly what happened when we were talking with Clari, right? Like they came and they were talking about what they're building, what their vision is, and I was like, this sounds like my script. And when that happens, you kind of know that okay, you're still going to be building what you wanted to be building, and you're still going to be getting there, but maybe at a different scale, and that kind of just stuck out. And the second part was definitely the cultural fit piece, and it's very hard to judge those things early on. We had many conversations, and I felt that that was a place where people would feel, as comfortable as they felt in their current context, and everybody would have a home in the new organization. So those were, that was kind of the other yes or no question. But literally, the big question was, listen, we had this vision of trying to solve this problem for sales teams, and I know the product still does that, but for us to actually fully solve that problem, we would want to add like these other things to the product, and we were already moving in the direction of doing some of the things that Clari was doing, and so it just seemed like, oh, I don't have to build all of this from scratch. We could do this together and deliver on that promise much faster and better. And that's literally what happened. Of course,
Got it.
through that journey, you learn a lot more about how organizations get built, and yeah. So you also get to learn at a very different scale in a larger organization.
Mhm. Sure, sure.
Folks, I mean, if you listen to this, you have been privileged enough to hear the journey of a young SaaS company in India becoming big and becoming acquired by a major player in the world. And I mean, Shruti's been super kind enough to tell exactly what went in the process of it. And I've always looked up to Shruti for doing this, right? It's very easy to slightly be more protective of your baby and feel that, hey, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to take it down the road 10-12 years. And it's another very a matured and a very nuanced take on how you're going to basically join hands with a larger organization, and then figure out, okay, hey, can I get to my end goal faster if I join hands, right? And it's something that I've always admired Shruti for. I think when I heard about that news, I pinged her immediately and I said, "This is such a superb news," and I mean, felt very happy from seeing somebody from Wingman going to that distance. And Shruti, thank you again for coming on this. I mean, on the deep dive with us, and being as usual as you are.
Thanks, Siddharth. Thanks, Shafiq. No, this was a wonderful conversation, and yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you
you.
for taking the time and speaking with our audience. I surely learned a lot. I'm sure our audience also did. Good luck with the acquisition, and we wish Wingman and Clary many success in the times ahead.
Yes.
Thanks, Shafiq.
Wingman by Clari IPO, 5 years.
Absolutely. Not
All
five
right,
years,
folks.
hopefully sooner.
Yeah, pretty soon. Nice. All right, folks. This is us signing off. Take care. Have a nice evening, afternoon, wherever you're based out of from. See you.
All
Bye,
right,
everyone.
bye.
Bye.
Thank you.